So, banking oligopoly or oligarchy is a concept introduced by Simon Johnson of MIT, and I hope you're all following his blog, The Baseline Scenario, which is one of the most illuminating commentaries on the financial crisis. So where do they fit into the picture? What went wrong? Were the banks adding wealth? Was what they were doing valuable to the economies? And is Simon's bank oligarchy theory correct? Well, first thing, what went wrong is it wasn't credit. It wasn't owing too much. It was liquidity. It's really important to understand, and we went through that in the panel, so I'm going to go through that really fast. Liquidity trumps accounting solvency. That's all you need to know. If you're not liquid, then you're going to go down when there's a crunch. Did the banks add wealth to their nations? No, they just enriched other bankers, as it turns out. Here's what happened. We got 10 years of ever-increasing, very large profits in the banking industry, leading to 10 years' worth of ever-increasing and very large bonuses. Fantastic. However, the losses in the last year exceeded all of those profits. You add up all the profits that were made, out of which those bonuses were paid, and those losses exceeded them all. So that actually there wasn't any profit, and there actually shouldn't have been any bonuses. It's very important to understand this. Say I have a bet with you where we'll toss a coin, or roll a dice, let's say. And if it comes up with anything but one, you'll pay me a good bonus. And we roll it, and we roll it, and we roll it, and I keep making that nice bonus. If, on the other hand, I roll a 1, I won't get a bonus. In fact, you'll get all the money you've ever paid me. Will I pay that to you? No, I can't. Sorry, I developed a new kitchen for my wife last year, and I spent all that bonus. Okay, who pays it? Well, the government will pay you if we roll a 1. We roll a 1, the government pays you. We roll anything else, you pay me. Is that all right? So the losses were recovered by saving the banks and replenishing the equity. And we've replenished the equity through government injections, which impoverish taxpayers. That's you and me, by the way. And new equity, which impoverished existing shareholders, which unfortunately was also you and me if we, had pension schemes or whatever. All right, so the bonuses were not repaid in that circumstance. So let's look at Simon Johnson's belief that the banks are an oligarchy, like any other oligarchy that takes over a country and uses that country's economic system for its own benefit. He, by the way, used to be the chief economist for the IMF, so he's entitled to have a view, and his view is very compelling. Banks suddenly, in the mid-90s, started lending, whether in the euro area or the US, at a far higher rate than they had done so before. Not, of course, in Japan. And my belief, I was a consultant to banks for about 15 years. My belief is that in the 80s, bankers were honorable, decent people doing good things. And I really liked all my clients, and I thought they were great. The beginning of the 1990s saw a change in the behaviors, attitudes, and business dealings of the major banks of the West. The share of the financial sector in GDP went up everywhere. Now, at the beginning of the last century, from 1910 to about 1930, bankers were paid about 60% more on average than you or me. Apparently, at the time, bankers were worth being paid 60% higher than the average person in other industries. You can believe that's true, you can believe that's not true. Incidentally, I heartily recommend a book to you, Once in Golconda, which is a book about these times. And there are so many parallels with what happened in the last decade, except that in those days, the bankers knew they were having ramps and creating bubbles. They were doing it deliberately, and they were allowed to by law. I believe that they didn't really realize they were doing it in the last decade. But anyway, there they were, earning a lot of money, making ramps, stealing from the public, pushing shares up in bubbles, and then quickly getting out at the top and leaving the shares to collapse. It's all in that book, Once in Golconda. Wonderful book. And so regulation came in the 30s. And all of these laws were passed where those red bars are. This is all, you can see the reference down at the bottom. And bankers' pay collapsed until by around 1990, bankers were being paid about the same as you or me. Just by regulating banks and preventing some of those bad things from happening, bankers' pay had dropped back to about, in my opinion, where it should have been. Because I don't think banking is actually, in general, more or less difficult than that in any other industry. Oh dear. We removed all of that regulation and legislation, and now bankers are earning about 70% more than you or me. And they still are, because banker pay hasn't changed. But it all happened very recently, from about 1990 onwards. Now, there have been some new laws in place. Will they have any effect? Will those laws go any further? I'm indebted to Simon Johnson for most of this analysis, by the way, but I think it's very powerful. The profits in the US financial sector rose as a result of all of this to be around 30–35% of the entire economy. Now think very hard, put your quantitative MIT hat on, think about sort of banking and think of the economy. Should it be that 35% of the profits of the economy are made from banking? I don't see anybody nodding, but I don't think there are many bankers in the room. So in theory, there's some banking activities that create value. Intermediation, risk management, advisory. These things are useful in a society. And I would argue, the way it feels to me, gut feel, that's about, 10% of the economy, somewhere between 5 to 50% of the economy. We need all of that. Banking is very important. We were just told it's really important for making the economy go. Seems to me that's about 5 to 15% of the economy. The rest of financial services activities are what's known as a zero-sum game. Trading, oligopoly profit, speculation, all of these things, you can make money out of them, but that means somebody else loses money. And I'm now going to introduce you to a really important technical term that's used extensively in banking, but for some reason the bankers don't mention the use of this term to their customers. It's the terms stuffer, stuffing, stuffy. Think perhaps of a Strasbourg goose being stuffed with corn to create the wonderful foie gras that is needed. Okay, to make money in those areas, you have to be a stuffer selling to stuffies. With the ultimate stuffy, if there's nobody else to pay, being the government, which, by the way, means us, because there's only us funding the government. Okay, so the full story of how stuffers stuff the stuffies hasn't really been told. It's a remarkable story, and as somebody with a view into the banking industry, because I'd consulted to it so long and knew so many bankers and talked about it all the time with my colleagues, it's really weird. The stuffers are the ones who are really financially sophisticated. They're in the middle of the deal. It's the moral hazard problem you were talking about, Evangelos. And they possess very finely tuned and complex pricing models. Just recently, in the past couple of weeks, we've heard about flash trading, which is where computers literally, in microseconds, spot a trend, calculate it, jump in, and make money. And they're very strong negotiators. People who know how to say, I think you should pay me a lot of money for this thing I'm doing for you, and here's why. It doesn't have to be true, they just have to be very good at negotiating that point. On the other hand, stuffies are financially unsophisticated, price inelastic, and poor negotiators or no negotiators. Because the most common response to a banker when they said, the price is this, is to say, okay, I think you should pay me this. Okay. Now, what happens then is that a whole raft of individuals across the financial services industry and you meet them every day, but you don't realize you're meeting a stuffer, meets a whole raft of individuals, often which are you, in one or another of your guises as an economic actor, being a stuffy. Whether you're there as an investor, large or small, whether you're investing for your company or for yourself, whether it's your pension, whether it's your financial advisor who is over on the left, stuffing you on the right, whether you're borrowing a credit card at 18 or 22% interest, at whatever. The list goes on and on and on. And what you need is price and market transparency in order to avoid that. What you've got is opaque pricing structures, disinformation, and obfuscation. Some people have been going on about this for decades, and it's been getting worse and worse, and it is not being addressed. Let me give one example. This is by one of the saints of the financial services industry, John Bogle. He's an 80-something-year-old man who's been living with a heart transplant for 20 years. He founded Vanguard, which is now the second largest mutual fund company in America. And he's sainted because he believes his job is to provide a service to his customers at the lowest possible cost and the least possible risk. He's pointed out that if you invested $1,000 in 1984, then by 2002, the S&P would have gone up eightfold by $8,000. But anyway, it went up eightfold. So that's fantastic, right? If you had invested as the average investor $1,000, you'd have $8,000 many years later for your retirement. Well, actually, no, you wouldn't. No, that's what the S&P did. The average equity mutual fund went up by $4,400. That's an awful lot of difference. That is $3,490 lost to bad trades. In other words, that equity mutual fund traded badly so that it didn't go up as much as the S&P, and also acknowledged costs, things they told you they had charged you. Over those years, those little pecks at your money left that at 4,400. So you say, well, okay, I didn't go up eightfold. That's a pity, but it was a great bull run. And all the same, I'd get, if I invested 1,000, I'd get 4,400, right? That's not too bad, is it? Well, no. No, you didn't get that. That's what the average equity mutual fund reported. What did the average equity mutual fund investor get? Now, one of the important things to understand is the average equity mutual fund investor is a 62-year-old widow, utterly financially unsophisticated, paying upfront charges, 2% a year, getting pecked and pecked and pecked, getting stuffed in so many ways you wouldn't believe it. What the average investor got was $660. This is just one out of that long list that I showed you on the previous page. And in fact, my thesis to you is not that the bankers are bad people. They're just doing what human beings do. If you put yourself in the market to sell any kind of product or service, you want to sell it at the highest price you can possibly get. And they succeeded. It's not them who are bad, it was us. It wasn't the banks who were bad, it was the bank's shareholders, it was the bank's management, it was the bank's employees, it was the bank's regulators, it was the bank's credit rating agencies. It was all of us who utterly failed to detect this oligarchy developing and growing in our midst, and who said, okay, when we were told about the price. So at the end of the day, the customer got $660, and the mutual fund managers and their counterparties got $7,240. It's utterly astounding. How can this stand? Bogle wrote this book quite a few years ago, and it passed without a ripple. The employees of banks stuff the shareholders. The winning banks stuff the losing banks. The winning banks and the losing banks stuff both the wholesale customers and the retail customers, and they all stuff the central banks and governments and taxpayers when anything goes wrong. It's a glorious game, except that it doesn't work to get an economy going, because all of that money could have gone into real industry. And it could have grown companies, but it hasn't. And even within the financial services industry, let's look at old Lehman. We thought they were a trading giant. I was so respectful of Lehman. I thought it was a fantastic organization. What was it? A stuffy. AIG, we thought they were a daring counterparty. You know, the only people who would offer one side of a trade on those super seniors. Well, there was a reason, because those super seniors were a bunch of horse manure. Merrill, solid investment bank. No, it wasn't. It was the stuffy for Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And in fact, we all knew that all along. We saw Merrill on the wrong side of the trade, year after year after year. Northern Rock, well, forget about it. The continental European banks, very important for you to understand in Germany. For decades, the American banks that I would advise would talk about the Landesbank and other second-tier European banks as the place to stuff lousy securities. They couldn't originate, they didn't know how to originate, so they just had to sit downstream and from New York, Citicorp or whoever, or JP Morgan would say, we've just originated a loan with these people over here. Your share is 5%, and you will be getting 3 basis points in margin. Thank you very much. And ultimately, if you're stuffy, everything goes wrong, even if you're only accepting 3 basis points. And that did happen. And that hurt your economy very significantly here by the Landesbank and others being significant stuffies. Now, another really important thing to understand is that CEO pay, 1960, CEOs got 30 times as much as the average worker in America. By 2008, they were getting 475 times as much. Japan only 11 times. In Germany, only 12 times. Now, that's why things didn't go so badly wrong here. But what was happening, it was they have this phrase in America, you're somebody's enabler. Where, if somebody's a drug addict, you're their enabler because you support them while they go off and get their drugs. Well, the CEOs and the banks were co-enablers, because the equity analysts who worked for the banks would write about how this was a fantastic company, and the CEO was deserving of 475 times as much as anybody else, $50 million a year, whatever. And then the CEO would pay huge fees to the investment bank for all these important things they were doing, like writing equity reports about them. And so it wasn't just the banks. And again, what happened to the shareholders, to the institutional investors, to the regulators? Why didn't they stop this sort of utterly absurd payment? Because it all ended in tears. Everybody said for years it's going to end in tears, and everybody who said that was sort of kicked out of their jobs or sidelined or whatever, and it did end in tears. Okay, so somebody, was it the banks that did it? Yes. Had they escaped retribution? Yes. There have been a few scapegoats, but it's mostly the same leadership. Is there any sign they've changed their behavior? No. There was this talk earlier about, well, we can't possibly have the same crash in the same way as we had before. I'm not so sure, because things are much the same. We are all still outside the banking industry behaving as stuffies, and the banks are still behaving as stuffers. The big 4 banks now approach true oligopoly status. The big 4 banks in America, JP Morgan, Citicorp, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they have about 50% of the market, or they've got over 50% of all mortgages. They've got 2/3 of all credit cards. When you've only got 4 competitors in a market, they can start charging massive fees. What's been done to prevent this all happening again? I would argue very little. It really doesn't seem that way. So what's the medium-term outlook?